So I'm going to welcome John Hartley, my dear friend. I think you heard him this morning. And yeah, so tell us a little bit of like why this matter for Cruz? I mean, what is this like really focusing on like people affected by conflict and fragility and violence?
Thank you, Catalina, and good afternoon to all of you. I must say I'd like to join Catalina in welcoming you to this session, and also thanking not only Catalina but the institutions she represents, the Climate Center of the IFRC, but also we've been working on this topic with UK Met. We've also got Andrew from Columbia University to help us through these discussions, and the reason I am very happy that this is on the agenda today is quite straightforward. We're talking a lot in this forum about early warning for all, and we'll simply not be able to get close to that goal, that objective, if we're not able to build these early warning systems in some of the most fragile countries, and within those countries, if we're not able to ensure that we're able to reach out to the people who have less access to those warnings, be it for political reasons, for conflict reasons, and so on. And it's obviously very close to my heart in my current function. A part of the cruise portfolio, we currently have a very long list of countries that are on the World Bank fragile state list. And actually, just the other day, I was literally just doing a quick counting of how many displaced people there are across our portfolio of countries. And so, just across the portfolio of countries we're working in, there are 19 million. People who are displaced. That I know from overseeing that they will not benefit currently from the services that our early warning center are currently developing. So that's already a lot of people that we're excluding from actually accessing these kind of services. So we as representing an institution. We are very much looking forward to these discussions today, Catalina, and allowing us to understand better how we can, and I'm so happy that we have the experts here today to understand how can we get better in ensuring that we can work in these specific contexts and ensure that the people who need them most access those warnings. So leave it back to you. I look forward to the flow of the discussions, and this discussion will certainly continue beyond this session about this issue of fragility. It's not going to stop here. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Joan. I think I have been really impressed with the way how Cruz has really embraced that concept of fragility and conflict, and making sure that the countries that they are supporting really receive everything that is needed to be able to do the early action that we need. So I think that has been a very fascinating move during the last few years. So for the ones who were this morning in the session, just a little bit of the background. So I have been working quite a lot on early warning systems for many years, and yeah, many years ago, I experienced firsthand seeing how people affected by conflict. I have been horribly affected by floods and heat waves. And I saw that gap in all the discussions at all possible levels. So I see that clearly, that we are not reaching the places that need the most. We have gaps, for example, on IDP camps or refugee camps of people that has been affected by conflict. Imagine Syria, imagine Iraq. We're going to talk about Cox's Bazar later. So there is a lot of work that needs to happen, and I think this requires new ways of working, and this is where it gets complex and interesting, because it is about really thinking about new partnerships with peace actors trying to figure out how do we work with the army, how do we work with like all these acts that normally are outside of the traditional process that we have. So I think there is a lot of things that we can impact with regards to this. So to get started, because I really wanted you to kind of like, you know, this morning I took you into memory lane. So now I'm going to take you to a very particular place called Turmericon. So this is just a fictitious scenario that really, the objective is just to kind of like put us on that place and say, oh, okay, this is what we are talking about, this very complex place that is a very high risk, and where we need to make sure that there is an early warning system that is like functional. So I want you to just very quickly, if there are not enough papers for everybody, we can just, you can just share, sit next to another person and then just, start to explore. And then once you read, I'm gonna give you just like a couple of minutes, like 3 minutes, so you can go through that, and then we're gonna do a very quick exercise, just to get us started on this, okay? So in the meantime, because I think this is gonna take like a couple of seconds, just to get a little bit of a sense in the room. Who here has been involved in the setting up of an early warning system in a context of conflict or in a context of violence? Yeah, good, John. I'm glad to hear. Andrew, I will hear about Andrew. Caroline, yes, certainly. A lot of community-based early warning systems and so on. Dorothy, she has done a lot of work, like recently in South Sudan, for example. Really fascinating. Anything else? I know Richard, like, yeah, don't be shy. No, you have been doing a lot of that as well. Great, so I think there is a lot of, I mean, this is not like the newest topic in the world. Like, there is a lot of experience, but the gap is huge, and there is a lot that we could do better. So okay, so just have a like, is everybody with the, do you have the papers? Like you don't have your papers. I think you will have them, yes. And for our audience online, in few seconds, you're going to have the online version of the story. Good, I'm just going to give you a couple more, maybe just 1 minute. Just like, just have a, what I want basically, the objective is just like skim that, just try to immerse yourself into that scenario and look at, okay, this is the complexity that we're dealing with. And this is an area where early warning systems are needed. So let's consider all these different factors of like protection and violence and the conflict between the two sides and the disparity between one of the sides and the other side, right? So I think let's get immersed into that. So we have an aspect, for example, that is very common in conflict settings of like weapon contamination, because of landmines or because of other aspects of artifacts or remnants of war, which is something that we always need to keep in mind if it's a flood or if there is even a heat wave. Good. So I think now I see that everybody's got a little bit of a sense of what is the scenario. So now, very briefly, what we're going to do is we're going to put ourselves in the position of someone who is going to, set up an early warning system. Like you are going to set up an early warning system in this context. And we're going to do a little bit of like the exercise that Pablo did earlier, for the ones who were in the session, and it's called the yes and. So we are going to get together. It could be a pair or it could be a trio. Just get clustered, you're close to each other. And then basically the first person is going to think about the first idea. Like what would you do to set up an early warning system in that context? So I give you an example. So the first thing that I will do is to understand what the militaries are doing in terms of like forecast. Because in some contexts, actually, the army has access to a lot of like forecast information. So this is a very random one, okay? Like I just want like something different. So just come up with like ideas that really relate to that context that you need to keep in mind when you are setting up these systems in a very complex like context. And you can look at it from different perspectives. From the forecast, we look at the value chain of early warning and early actions. It could be from the understanding risk to the forecast part, to the monitoring, the dissemination, the early action planning, the financing. So you can look at any of those elements. So let's just do it. They're just like 3 minutes of ideas. So just get together in the clusters where you are and just give a go. Think about how would you set up your early warning system? What you are going to keep in mind. And for our online people, that would be also great. So I don't know how many people is online? 15. Okay, so we don't have a record group. Okay, so for the online participants, I will open a free open discussion. So anybody that wants to unmute themselves and just start to think, like, I will consider X, Y, Z, I will consider, and then build on each other's ideas, okay? You can together. You can share. Let's do 1 more minute. Like a very simplified version of an early warning system, you know, like what are the key things that you should consider if you are designing the early warning system? Good. So I'm pretty sure that you are having very interesting discussions. Like, I have done this many times, and like we can unpack this for hours and hours and hours. So what I'm gonna do, I know there's so much substance to analyze. So it would be just great to hear a few thoughts, like from you. So I'm just gonna, Elena is gonna just pass the microphone, like anybody who wants to kind of like share some of the ideas that came out. So I'm pretty sure Viviana, you have a great idea.
Talked about a lot of things, but I think the first thing we started talking about was like who has data, who has information, what information exists, is it a forecast information at national level or at regional level? And then we also talked about kind of understanding historical and up-to-date power dynamics between different groups to understand what might have happened before, but also what might be the current situation, and being mindful of that in your assessment of risk and where's safe and who's in power and who's responsible. I'll start that off.
I love that, and I think that's a very important angle when we start to integrate conflict sensitivity within the design. So an analysis of power dynamics, which we otherwise wouldn't necessarily do it in a normal early warning system, is essential here, because information is power. Who holds the information, who transmits the information, can have really different influences in existing power dynamics at different levels. So I love that point. I think it's really great. Yeah, anybody else?
Oh, good. Something else that we spoke about was back to the power dynamics as well, knowing that there's sort of a distrust of the government. So who actually reaches out to the Usurian community with information, and maybe starting with a goal-centered approach and then walking backwards to a plan rather than bringing a plan in. And so getting a sense from them, like the goal is to protect your community. What do we have to do in order for that to happen? And then maybe along that line, share the plan that already exists, then comparing it to what they've already created and asking them, what do you think about this other option? But most likely the humanitarian organizations will have to do that interfacing and not government agencies.
That is brilliant. We need to put that into the guideline that we are writing. That's an excellent point. I mean, sometimes in some countries at different levels, you have different legitimacy. You know, it could be at a municipal level or a regional level or a national level, and that needs to be considered, because let's say Cruz is setting up an early warning system in Syria in this moment. It's another planet. It has to have a totally different approach than if it was set up in Kenya. So I think that those elements are so important, but also it's important to analyze as well the temporal aspects, because of course conflicts change over time very much. So you might be setting up part of your system, which is a national level sort of system, maybe waiting for things to change, and then move on to the next phase of process. I think that is such an interesting angle. Anyone has thoughts? Prof? Oh.
I'm going to readily admit I have never, ever had to deal with anything like this, and really have never even thought about it. So this is totally new, so this might seem somewhat naive, but it seems like the Wilmington government has the programs and has the money to be able to implement things in different additional areas. So the thing is trying to reach out to the others to let them know, hey, we can provide some assistance, but first you've got to stop the civil unrest that's going on, because we can't even send any workers in to help you out without risking them getting shot at. Does that sound too?
Yeah, no, it's the reality that happens in certain contexts. This might be a little bit of an exaggeration, like the case, but maybe no, in some contexts. But yeah, it's true. I mean, there is just so much complexity that you need to deal, and I think that element in this particular case, we put these two different contexts next to each other. It also opens up a lot the discussion of like the importance of like disaster diplomacy and a lot of other extra skills that you need to do to be able to manage again the power dynamics between different groups and so on. So that's one element, and then the other element that you mentioned is like how do we deal with the violence? And I think that's a very important perspective from a humanitarian perspective, on the sense that you wouldn't put people in harm for the sake of setting up the system. So that's another big part of the analysis that you need to look like. Is it really realistic? I mean, are the conditions of like violence stable enough to be able to go and do something? Because otherwise, you don't want to put people in harm in this sense. So I think that's another key aspect. Good. So great. I'm so glad that you get a sense, and I'm really grateful that you said that. Oh, that's an eye-opening. I never thought about it, because it's like that's the whole purpose of the session. So I think we achieved the objective just by knowing that. Great. Good. So as I was telling you before, a couple of years ago, I got very intrigued and curious about why we're not really doing early action in this context, and why we do have these gaps. And then I had the crazy idea of doing a PhD next to my normal job. But it's something that I really enjoy. I think it's something that is very important, and it really gives that opportunity to understand much better what are the gaps and what needs to happen. So I'm going to tell you just like super briefly, but these key findings that I had through my PhD. So one of the key elements that I wanted to look at was the forecast, because one of the maybe limitations that we always talk about is like, in a conflict context, in the middle of Iraq or Afghanistan, like, there is not going to be a forecast. It's just going to be very difficult. Like, why even try? There is not the information that we need. So what I wanted to look was at the potential of using global forecast models in like a really big picture analysis of different countries. And what I wanted to do was a historical analysis of the most impactful disaster events over the last 20 years, and looking at like were those events forecast and at what extent were they forecast. Just to have that general trend, to understand like is it like it's just very impossible, forget about it, or actually there is some hope, and we could definitely like explore that possibility of using those global like models, maybe together with other pieces of like critical information. So after this mega analysis that took me a long time, the conclusion was fascinating. Like most of their disasters were forecast, or not the disaster, the hazard was forecast. Most of them, like 64% of the events were forecast with a 30% probability, which is quite interesting, because if you're a disaster manager, a Red Cross or a local emergency, if we think about a 30% probability of a very high impact event happening, you will do something, either a no-regret action, or either a little bit or invest in certain type of early action. So there is that possibility. But overall, on my thought analysis, basically there were only 2 disaster events that were not forecast at all. And that was like an interesting eye-opening. There's a paper published, so I could read it. So that was like one thing. I just wanted to get that out. So it's like, yes, that myth that we cannot use forecast because it's just so difficult because there is no data is not necessarily the case. So we can do that. Now, I was really interested on the aspect of research, and I think John mentioned something very important this morning, is that there is not, if you compare with all the disciplines, there's not really a lot of academic research on early warning systems. Like it is growing, but it's limited. So I wanted to dig down a little bit more on that and look at research on contexts affected by conflict. So I look at these 20 countries, and then I wanted to observe all the value chain of research, from hazard research forecasting research, early warning research, dissemination, communication, financing, action planning, like all the value chain, to understand what are the trends, what has been more research. And I selected 20 countries. So the findings are like this. I wish I can show geography, but this is going to be very interesting. So basically, like very easy. I guess you know the answer. Which is the element that has been more researched? The forecast. There you go. Yeah. So the forecast is one of those, and hazard analysis. So these are so many papers in Afghanistan. Some of them in Afghanistan, but a lot of papers that really focus on that, understanding hazard, different type of hazards, and improving the forecast. Particularly, it's a lot of like remote sensing type of like research. But when we go into the kind of like social aspect of really translating the early warning into early action, particularly the communication, the dissemination, the early action, it's very, very, very little, like very, very, very little. It's just incredible. So this is really like an eye-opening and a kind of like evidence, like proof that there is need of more attention and more research to these other aspects of the value chain of early warning systems. So it's not rocket science, it's not the most revelatory research, but it's important because it shows the evidence that there is a huge gap and that there is opportunity, particularly for people here that is doing their PhDs, their masters, to contribute to a lot of that research. So those are like the two key elements that I have been working on. But there are a couple of particular ideas that have really caught my attention. So one is really focused on early warning for people living in refugee camps or IDP camps. So this is another area of research that is very clearly, the analysis in general is that there are some practices, particularly within the humanitarian sector, in cluster systems, there's a lot of ad hoc systems in place, but no robust, fully covered. And I think Nari is going to talk about later about this amazing new program that is trying to tackle that aspect. And then there is another emerging topic that I'm looking at. I find it very fascinating, and it relates again also to cruise. I'm like obsessed with it. So it relates to a lot of the work that you do, which is related to the investment that exists in hydromet infrastructure and a lot of that like technical, like hardcore equipment that is needed. And if you look at the perspective of the international humanitarian law, which protects essential items, like for example, hospitals, schools, or critical infrastructure like roads in some certain contexts, which is protected by the International Committee of the Red Cross, and there are mechanisms to make sure that there is a dialogue with the parties to the conflict to make sure that they don't attack those areas. And hydromet infrastructure is not mentioned within that protection, and that needs to change. Like, why not? Because we're thinking like then putting a little bit of a hat beyond everyone's systems of like climate change and like the need of more information in the long term. Well, we want to make sure that all these investments are protected. So that's another area of research that is emerging. Everybody welcome to join if you're interested. So this is just a little bit of an appetizer of the different pieces of work that is happening. Happy to discuss with any of you any potential collaboration. Now, we're going to go into something very interesting. Yelena has brought to us a really fascinating video from Haiti, a context that is very, I guess to many of you, but for me, very, very dear. I was in Haiti for like almost 3 years, and it's such a complex context with this, the difficult conditions, but also amazing population. And I think it's a place where early warning systems are so needed, particularly, of course, hurricanes, like floods and droughts and so much. And there has been a lot of work from Cruz. So we are very excited to hear about our colleagues in Haiti.
Marcelin, coordonnateur de l'unité météorologique d'Haïti, également représentant permanent d'Haïti. Alors, la question a été posée, comment les services d'alerte précoce sont-ils accessibles aux communautés touchées par les conflits, donc pour les déplacés. Alors, il faut dire que dans le cas d'Haïti, Haïti c'est pas un pays en guerre avec d'autres pays, mais le conflit des gangs qui existent en Haïti fait que il y a des déplacés. Mais pour moi, il y a deux sortes de déplacés. Il y a des déplacés qui sont actuellement sur les places publiques et au niveau des rues. Mais il y a des déplacés qui vont vers les villes de province. Peut-être probablement, les déplacés qui vont vers les villes de province ont probablement, se trouvent chez leur famille, ont peut-être accès à vraiment des services d'aide précoce. Au niveau de la protection civile, parce que la protection civile d'Haïti est représentée dans les villes de province, dans les départements et dans les communes. Mais pour ce qui concerne les déplacés et au niveau des places publiques et des rues, donc c'est là il y a le plus grand problème parce que ces déplacés-là n'ont probablement pas accès aux informations, sauf peut-être par la radio, mais peut-être il y a des difficultés peut-être que la personne a pour se nourrir, se loger, donc c'est ce qui fait peut-être son quotidien. Donc du coup, avoir accès pour se déplacer là au service d'aide précoce, c'est vraiment une difficulté. Alors maintenant, penser à des opportunités pour pouvoir surmonter le défi, c'est ça, effectivement. C'est important, quand ces cas-là se présentent, c'est nécessaire à ce que la protection civile fasse de son mieux pour que la personne peut vraiment gérer son quotidien, mais au moins avoir aux informations sensibles pour se protéger. C'est ça. Donc, peut-être il y a beaucoup encore à faire en Haïti en ce qui concerne la communication des alertes et aussi la gestion. Parce que en termes de communication, parce qu'il reste que le téléphone et les radios pour pouvoir avoir accès à certaines informations. Donc il faudrait quand même qu'il y ait des campagnes de sensibilisation à ce que ces informations-là touchent les personnes, particulièrement les personnes les plus vulnérables. Alors, à la question qui avait été posée, comment le CRUZ a-t-il pu soutenir mon travail dans le pays? Alors, il faut dire que sincèrement, si je devais répondre par un seul mot, je dirais largement. Largement pour la simple bonne raison que le CRUZ a investi d'abord dans le renforcement des capacités, ce qui m'a vraiment beaucoup aidé parce qu'on en a besoin et vraiment de la formation à tous les points de vue, pour tous les services. Donc, ceci va vraiment a été une contribution énorme. En deuxième lieu, donc, il faut dire que le CRUZ m'a vraiment aidé dans mon travail dans le pays, pour la simple bonne raison que on a eu l'appui d'un consultant, sans quoi je n'allais pas pouvoir répondre à toutes les obligations auxquelles je devrais répondre. Parce que nous avons vraiment du pain sur la planche pour répondre devant l'aviation, pour répondre pas devant la direction de la protection civile et bien d'autres obligations. Donc du coup, ceci a été vraiment un appui énorme, non seulement pour m'aider dans la préparation des réunions, des ateliers, mais aussi il servait le plus souvent pour être consulté en ce qui a trait avec toutes les questions d'alerte par rapport à la protection civile pour laquelle nous travaillons en amont. Donc ceci a vraiment, il faut dire que le CRUZ a beaucoup aidé en ce sens-là, tant dans le plan de renforcement, tant sur le plan de renforcement des capacités, mais aussi par l'appui que nous avons pu trouver dans le cadre de ce projet-là. Alors, autrement, on a parlé que dans des domaines où les produits d'alerte sont-ils utilisés pour renforcer la résilience des communautés. Moi, je vais dire autrement. La résilience des communautés, et particulièrement les communautés haïtiennes, passe nécessairement par leur façon de vivre, c'est-à-dire les moyens d'existence mis à leur disposition. Donc, c'est-à-dire les moyens d'existence mis à leur disposition. Donc, dans le cas d'Haïti, les communautés ne peuvent être résilientes dans cet état d'extrême pauvreté. Donc, C'est-à-dire qu'elles ne font que chercher leur quotidien, c'est-à-dire de quoi pour survivre, de quoi pour se nourrir, de quoi pour se vêtir. Donc, ainsi, pour renforcer la résilience des communautés et réduire l'impact des risques, il faut tout d'abord toucher les moyens d'existence de ces communautés-là. Ça encore, on ne pourra jamais parler de résilience. Ça, c'est mon avis. C'est pas obligatoirement, probablement, l'avis de tout le monde, mais moi, c'est comme ça que je comprends. Et
yeah, so he is the permanent representative of the Haiti Med Service, or WMO, so the head basically of the Med Service. I just want to ask very quickly before we pass to our next section to John, just something very briefly about Haiti. It's very like few words. Like Haiti is experiencing now like really high levels of violence. It's a very, very complex environment. So I wonder how Cruz is dealing with that to, you know, continue rolling like all these ambitions and these plans that you have with the Med Service.
Yeah, thank you, Catalina. So yeah, obviously Haiti is. I'll be honest with you. I was working in Haiti before I took this job. In Cruz, I was managing the UNDP program there, which is overseeing a lot of the services. And actually, this was in 2016, and we found this situation quite difficult in those days. But I mean, compared to now, it probably feels like a holiday destination. The situation has obviously got a lot worse. So obviously we've tried to maintain what we call basic capacity, basic services of the meteorological service, but also of the civil protection. At this stage, we don't have a very ambitious program there, but we're trying to ensure that when I'm talking about basic services, we're talking literally about ensuring that they pay their bills for the electrical bills, that they can continue accessing internet, so that they can access the global prediction products of WMO. But those are the types of basic. We're talking very basic services in place. The head of the Med Service currently cannot access the office in Haiti. Those are just some of the realities that. Where it is built is a part of the city that they can't access. So there's no. Those are some of the typical operation realities of working in some of these very difficult conflict situations. But obviously we'll continue providing those basic services, and obviously we're also aspiring to see the situation, the overall situation, political situation, evolve positively in Haiti, and then we will try hopefully continue building the capacity. Just to say that we wouldn't want the situation to deteriorate any further, because then we'd probably lose some of the services that we've already put in place. So at the moment, as I say, we hope that our financing partners will continue accepting that we're financing a program which hasn't delivered to the standards that we had set out in the project from the start, with an understanding that the complex situation, when the socio-political situation has led to where we are right now. So that's just a little bit more information on what's going on in Haiti.
That was great, John, because that just shows the clear example of how difficult, just a simple thing, just keep it the normal functioning. So that this is not only in Haiti, it's happening in many other contexts. So now, we're gonna invite here to the stage Andrew and Nairi, and we're gonna look into two very interesting examples. Like Nairi is gonna share with us what the UK Met Office is doing. It's a big program, I'm a big fan, called like Wiser. And they have something very interesting happening in the Middle East, in the MENA region in general. That is quite relevant. I don't know all the things what you have seen happening at the moment. So very interesting. And then Andrew has been working already for quite some time in many things, but I think one in particular is setting up an early warning system in Cox's bazaars. We have like some really interesting insights on that complexity. So. You go first?
Okay, so thank you so much for organising the session, and thanks so much for giving us the opportunity to share with you a little bit more of the work of the FCGO-funded WISER programme. This is the Weather and Climate Information for Services programme. And this was started back in 2015, and it was in recognition that we had noticed there were quite a lot of different climate programs or weather and climate programs happening across the African region, which is sort of where we were probably working at the time, through our international development, supporting Met services to help improve their services. And also FCGO, which was doing at the time, had also noticed that they weren't entirely sure what the impact of those programs had been. So there had been a lot of funding across the continent, but we weren't getting a lot of information out as to how many people impacted, you know, what kind of work was actually making progress. So, next one. So basically, after a lot of scoping, there was a program that was designed mainly for East Africa, so looking across weather and climate timescales. So sort of impact-based forecasting, but also seasonal climate information. How could we work with the regional climate centres to strengthen the seasonal outlooks that they were providing through to national level, and also doing some interesting research work at longer term climate timescales, looking at climate risks and potentially, obviously, how we could inform adaptation. This program, which started in 2015, quickly was starting to produce results, and FCDO asked us to then extend into the South Asia region, using similar approaches, which I'll come on to later, which we've now captured, but also obviously recognizing that every region has a different contextual situation, a different situation that needs to be managed. And now this program has extended into the, it's now called WISER Africa, the WISER MENA region, and WISER Asia Pacific. So again, we've been able to showcase quite clearly a lot of the impact of this work, and that has led to future funding and being able to scale up our activities. So really just making sure that, you know, looking across timescales, we're providing weather and climate information in a way that users can apply it and can take action. Go to the next one, please. So just looking at the overarching principles of WISER. So this came out of the first program that we delivered, and lots of backwards, toing and froing. This is obviously an ongoing dialogue with the UK government, but also the people that we worked with to help implement the programs. So it wasn't just Met Office doing all this implementation. We were obviously providing the expertise around the technical assistance really around the weather and climate information, but working with agencies like Red Cross, World Food Programme, the Raja programme that you'll have heard about, working with lots of different agencies who are on the ground and understand those vulnerabilities, and of course the Met services, and where possible, you know, really extending down into the communities to understand their context. So really the focus on let's support the action, let's think about the actions that need to be taken right from the start so that we can then understand what kind of information they need to take action. The co-production is inevitable, absolutely necessary in terms of, you know, there's no way you're going to provide accurate information if you haven't worked together to understand how to make sure the weather and climate information works for the people on the ground. The gender equity and social inclusion, exactly like the session we were talking about earlier that I attended earlier downstairs, you know, you've got to make sure that you're working with that in mind and designing that in your programs right from the beginning. It's not just a tick box at the end. It really has to be within the original design of the program. Looking at how we can do things differently. You know, there's a lot of amazing minds in this room and around the world, and sometimes there will still just be a conversation that you have at that community level that just makes you think a little bit differently, and it's always important to make sure you're open to other ways of doing things. Working with local providers as a member of the World Meteorological Organization, the Met Office, we won't go it alone. If they're not in a position to provide early warnings or robust early warnings, the idea is we support that work through our weather and climate information. We have good global, regional level modelling, so we can really support in terms of science, and also in supporting those dialogues between the Met Services, their government and their agencies that extend down to community level, and bringing, you know, whilst they're building their resource and capability, potentially in conflict environments or, you know, see just less developed countries, how can we help them get that information out whilst building their capability at the same time? And then looking at the sustainable change and transformational effect. And it's really interesting because we talk a lot about the first mile now, and that's amazing actually, because that, like you were saying earlier, that's a huge progress. I'm almost coming a full loop and trying to remind governments that this is important, so I feel like I'm kind of going back to the original way it used to just be government down. But I think this is the important bit, because if they don't start understanding the value of this work and funding it themselves, when they are in a position to do so, we are going to have this transformational effect of the work that we do. So, sorry, just flick through the whole, I don't know who's doing it actually.
Oh, no,
so it's
Helena.
disappeared.
Oh, it's
you. Okay, cool. Thank you. It just flicked through the whole thing and I'll talk to it. Thank you. So, obviously, you need all of this co-production. So the next slide. Yeah. Thank you. Oh, you missed the word. No, that's cool. So go back. Thank you. So the science and the application. This is all great, but you can't do that without the middle column, right? So we will have the most, you know, I think we have the most amazing work in climate science in the world. We do fantastic research, etc. And a UK perspective, there is no way that's of any use unless we've spoken to the public and the civil contingency advisors and the national adaptation planning people and what have you. So you have to do this, working with those other agencies who understand how this can be used on the ground, and people, basically, and having that reach. And then, and this will obviously all help to make sure that you're working together. Like if you don't work together, we always joke about this in the flood forecasting centre, because Brian over there is going to tell me off if I've got the story wrong, I think. But basically, after 2007 storm, there was a pit review saying, you know, the Environment Agency needs to work with the Met Office, you know, combine your forecast with what you know is going to happen water on the ground. Until that happened, the blame game was going on. You guys got it wrong, you didn't get the information out, or you didn't give us the right forecast or whatever. When you're working together, you're building trust, you're building knowledge of what you think is going to happen, and you kind of get rid of that blame game, because you want to work together, you're producing something, you're not going to then turn around to your mate sitting at the next desk and go, oh, you're in trouble. So I think that is really key, and also when we go in country, it's so important to work with Met Services and government agencies we have history with. We work with the Voluntary Cooperation Programme at WNO. It's like, you know, ridiculous amounts of country that they've supported around the world, and we will prioritise those countries we've worked with before for that reason, to make sure we get that trust working well for all of us. Next one, thank you. Oh, yes, that was the other bit, that one. Anyway, that's all policies, government actions, you know that bit. We just want to make sure we're making the right decisions, that we're informing policy, and all of this leads to better actions. So this leads me on to the next slide, I think, where I was talking, you know, we've extended into wiser Asia Pacific, wiser MENA, and wiser Africa. And it's a wiser MENA bit I'm going to talk to you about today very briefly, give you a summary of, and then Catalina will take it from there and give more detail. So next one, thank you. Cool. So we did quite a big scoping report for the MENA region, and one of the key areas of focus that came out of that scoping report, which I think is published, you can access it on the Met Office website, was the need for improved dialogue, understanding between users and producers of weather and climate information, the need to build resilience to extremes among IDPs and refugees, the need for strengthening seasonal forecasting in region, so looking a bit longer term, and then also supporting weather and climate initiatives in the region. And that's the whole thing that has been the ethos of WISER right from the beginning as well. Let's not reinvent the wheel. Let's look at what's working effectively already and add value to it, or give it a boost, scale it up, etc. So these are what came out of the, very high level, what came out of the scoping report. The next one, please. And now there is a grant that has been issued under the WISER MENA program. So Met Office manages this program, and we also are providing technical assistance. And that again is with our wider on climate information and modeling, but working with partners like Red Cross Global Food Programme, where we are looking at basically increasing the climate resilience of IDPs working together, and also looking to understand a little bit better about obviously the practice, the exchange and the advocacy and learning that will come out of that, so that hopefully we can apply this elsewhere. And I understand that this is rolling out, this is basically going to be in Iraq, Syria, Yemen and Palestine. Again, with the idea that we are not taking over the role of the Met services in those countries if they exist at the moment. Obviously, in hugely countries of conflict, hugely challenged. The idea is we provide this information, make sure it's using and helping to save lives and livelihoods, whilst looking at how we can build up that capability once, hopefully, that conflict comes to. I think. I hope.
Yes, you did, Mary. Thank you so much. So, just to complement a little bit of this, this is one of the first programs that is so targeted, so specific in the sense that there is extremely vulnerable population, like people in situation of displacement, either on camps or either on urban areas. And really focus on how to make sure that this population is covered. In those countries where the med services experience a lot of complexity, so there's gonna be a really interesting challenge. Like Caroline here is gonna be the one leading that from the British Red Cross side, and yeah, so I think there's gonna be a few years ahead that are gonna be very, very fascinating, where we're gonna have a lot of learnings, and I think we need to work with crews on that. Good. So now we're gonna move to Bangladesh. So Andrew, tell us, what did you do?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you, Catalina. Hi, everybody. I'm Andrew. I'm coming from New York, from the university. I also work with the University of Twente in the Netherlands and also with the Crescent Center. So, let's see. So in 2017, I took this picture in the afternoon after a morning full of meetings with the Intersector Coordination Group. The Intersector Coordination Group is essentially when we talk about decision makers in a refugee camp or refugee camp managers. The Intersector Coordination Group is, yes, a place where those decisions get made. They're the decision makers. Not only engineering decisions, but also shorter term decisions related to risk reduction, early warning, for example, and other elements related to livelihoods and questions around how refugees can thrive even when there's 1 million living in a single location, or actually throughout the peninsula here in Bangladesh, but approximately 700,000 in Kutupalong, which is the mega camp pictured here in Cox's Bazar. And in that morning meeting, a phrase that was very common still sticks with me today. So I hope this helps, is something that was a theme emerging from one of the main roles and responsibilities that I had as an advisor to the Intersector Coordination Group. And that phrase was included on countless number of emails sent by scientists from the US, tech people from Silicon Valley, the best universities in Japan, all over the world. People wanted to help. People wanted to send what they perceived to be their best forecast or their best flood map or their highest resolution representation of landslide risk in Cox's Bazar. And almost all the emails ended off with that. And yeah, I'm a meteorologist, I should say. So I'm a physical scientist that has worked in the humanitarian sector for over 10 years and has done a lot of work in building early warning systems and thinking about the appropriateness of forecasts and different types of data that goes into decision making. But it really struck me in this case, just because of the publicity around the Rohingya refugee camps and the amount of attention it was gaining. One of the main challenges for me as an advisor was not, trying to develop a new forecast, which was initially one of the reasons why I went. We need a new flash flood forecast. We need a new landslide forecast. No, it was coming up with the process to identify and prioritize, and therefore deprioritize different data sets that were becoming available. And almost all of the ones that were sent over to the intersector coordination group went like that. Dear refugee camp managers, we really want to help. We have the best forecast for you. We know things are really bad there. We are so sorry for it. We hope this helps. And it still sticks with me today, because it refers to the lack of understanding of the context, the privilege, and taking advantage of the privilege of being able to project what someone perceives to be appropriate and helpful onto a situation where there's very little understanding of the complexity that's going on, and then repackaging that into stories and narratives that you'd see on LinkedIn later. That would be like, so-and-so people, we are helping, we are sending our forecasts, we are saving lives. So I want to start off with that because I think it's important when we're talking about any context really, but specifically in fragile settings, or any deviation from a standard operating procedure, no matter how informal or ad hoc it's being developed, there are systems in place. And we must be extra careful when we're interacting and influencing. So it's not only about the benefit that can come from our data, but it's also about understanding that privilege, and the responsibility and the accountability. And I'm glad to see that coming out in the conference a little bit, but it's worth emphasizing and very important. And something that, as a physical scientist, you're not trained in that. You're trained to say, if you want to work in disaster management or humanitarian or international policy, just get the maps out there. More data is what we need. We need better models. But really, what does better mean if we're not defining effectiveness by the reduction in disproportionality of impact on the most underserved populations? So here's a picture of, I forget what camp this is, sub-camp rather. This is Katukulong mega camp, and this is another image that still sticks in my mind. You could see this area here. So it's hard to tell here, but Bangladesh is relatively flat in 90% of the land area, except around Cox's Bazar and the Chittagong Hill Tracts. This is approximately, 100 meters in elevation here, and this area was forested before the Rohingya refugee camp was built. There is one tree left, and I keep this picture in mind, and I think about this because it's so striking to me, and there's many questions that could come from this. And I feel like some answers could come from why this one tree was left. And I use it here mostly for scale, to understand the height and the depth of these trees compared to the landscape and how much it's changed. And as a meteorologist, I'm thinking, how could any forecast provider or data provider really grasp the amount of change that has happened with the terraforming of these lands, with the changing in the hydrology? How could anybody proclaim that their forecast would be useful, specifically for floods and landslides, if you didn't understand the amount of land cover and land use change that has happened in the last week or months? I was asked to help with flood forecasting and flood risk assessment, and this picture was taken in February. And if people know, February is the hottest time of year in Bangladesh, this part of Bangladesh. It's also the driest part of the year. If you look down here, there's already ponding of water. There's already indications of areas that are likely to flood because they're already flooding. So it was an interesting context on various levels, but one of the questions around where are the risks of flash floods, essentially nowhere in this area is at non-zero risk of flash floods. Everywhere there is some level of risk. So it quickly became an activity less about trying to identify where there risk of flash floods and where there's no risk, but think about that across a gradient in the spectrum of different thresholds of risk that already exist even before the rainy season, for a variety of reasons. We see over here in the blue, these are latrines built on the hill slope. These all drain down to certain parts of the refugee camp. And these were tasks of the intersected coordination group. All of this, the camps housing the 1 million refugees, all of them are on the list to have better drainage, better infrastructure. But where do you prioritize? Where do you go first? You know, the pre-monsoon convective storm season was upon us, and some areas needed to be prioritized. How does that prioritization happen? And on the other side, how does the deprioritization justify when everybody is the most vulnerable? And I think that's one of the most unique elements of fragile context. Everyone is the most vulnerable. So you're dealing with the tails of the distribution of vulnerability, and you still need to deprioritize some people. So just facing that reality of knowing you have to deprioritize the most vulnerable people to some extent is, I think, important for people to understand, because that's the reality of working in these contexts. So me, as a scientist who had experience working in the humanitarian sector before this activity and working in the refugee camp, I wasn't naive to the fact that a lot of data existed, but this was a situation where I went in thinking, you know what, I'm not sure what data is available in the refugee camp until I got there, and I realized that there were too many maps and there was too little time to really prioritize and disaggregate and evaluate the appropriateness of everything. This is just a selection of many maps, I don't know about 100, but many types of maps representing risk of different types of floods, different types of precipitation forecasts, some from the Bangladesh Meteorological Department, some from the regional entities such as ADBC, some from global centers, some from people that just thought they had a nice app that they really thought was. But, you know, it's the responsibility. If you're in the intersected coordination group and someone writes you email saying we have the best forecast, what, you're not going to evaluate it? You're just going to disregard it? No. Thinking about the accountability of the scientists to disseminate that, there's also roles and responsibilities within the decision makers to at least somehow try to vet what's available and think about how to prioritize some and integrate some over others. So this was the reality. There was way too much data and too little time to make a decision to do an appropriate skill evaluation. Sometimes in some of the sessions I'm hearing like, well, if there's a lot of forecasts, just evaluate the skill and pick the best one. Well, how do you evaluate skill where there's very little data? You know, not only in terms of historical record, but also in terms of even just how the land is changing and evolving. Oh yeah, this is a question that comes up quite a bit, not only in the refugee camps, but whenever we're talking about areas where we have a lot of data. This is the question where it usually boils down to. Sometimes I'm asked to do more quantitative assessments of forecast skill or risk analysis, and many times the resulting question is, all right, just tell us which one is the best, and just tell us which one do you trust. But I think these are very real questions in any context. Again, specifically the trust part, which I know many have touched on. It's really hard to define what that means when, again, everyone is the most vulnerable. So if we're talking about a way to understand effectiveness and essentially the trust processes built into decision-making, how is that done in these sorts of situations? I don't have an answer, but it's something that must be integrated into the development of early warning systems and anticipatory action systems. So what did we do? The second visit to the Rohingya refugee camp was actually funded in part by NASA with IOM, International Organization of Migration, and UNDP. And on that second visit, our intention was to develop a new type of landslide early warning system, and that was done. But I'm not showing that here today because I think relevant to these discussions here, and also to show some vulnerability and growth on my side, this project turned in mostly into a social science project of trying to map out the decision-making processes within the intersected coordination group. This is a product we have here called the decision-making flowchart. This has evolved and there's different formats of this, but essentially this was used for workshopping within the intersected coordination group to say, all right, how do we break down the specific questions you're asking on a daily or weekly basis? One of the examples they gave was every Monday we have a meeting, and the question we ask is, do we move out the diggers and dozers to terraform new land this week? That's a very concrete question they asked. And going through the process of what data do they use, what data is available but they don't use, how do you prioritize different forecasts if you're talking about rainfall or other factors, that all went into the process of building out this decision-making flowchart, as we called it. This is captured in a workshop report that we held in the refugee camp with decision makers and humanitarian actors there. I will tell you, we must have went through 30, 40 questions. We never once filled this out completely because it really wasn't the point. The point was to have discussions around the questions that are being asked, the data sets that are perceived to be available and actually available, what are the sources, what are the mandates around the different data sources, and why are some being prioritized over others? The example of the diggers and dozers question, we went around the table for, I don't know, 10, 20 minutes, and someone was like, I know there's a forecast that we use. Like, hey, what was the forecast that we use? Every Monday we have the thing, there's a slide at the end of that discussion, right? We went back and forth. Finally, someone had the USB key, they plugged it in, they scrolled to the end of the thing. And I remember I saw what was on the slide and my heart like sunk. They were using a screenshot, every week someone would take a screenshot of a Canadian website called the Weather Network. And they would take a screenshot of what the Cox's Bizarre forecast said for 7 days. And they're like, oh, yeah, this is what we use. And I'm like, well, first, at least we got to that point of identifying what is used. But my question was just like, why? When you have so many different forecasts available, like, how does this get prioritized? And they're like, oh, well, it's probably just as good as the other ones. And it's like, well, like, I'm not one to say that's not as good as the other ones, but still, like, how is this justified as like what's elevated into one of the not only most severe and acute humanitarian situations in the world, but also one of the most publicized? Like, why would you expose yourself to that risk? So, anyways, but that's the reality. In many cases, there's so much else to think about. You know, why would the consideration around availability of forecast even come to mind? But anyways, that was one of the examples there. But again, me as a meteorologist, I never thought that this would be really one of the main activities of building an early warning system, or in this case, we tried to build an anticipatory action system. But it was a major step in thinking about the standard operating procedures within the intersector coordination group of identification of forecast, prioritizing different forecasts, deprioritizing other forecasts, and trying to inform that selection process with an understanding of things like mandates, government entities, global products. What is the constellation of data that's available, and how are these discussions had to prioritize some over others? So I'll leave you with this slide. We highlighted some of these topics in a paper a couple of years ago, talking about what are some of the questions and also some examples of what needs to be done. To what extent is it irresponsible, to even consider replicating an early warning system in a non-fragile context, in a fragile context, just giving the differences, and giving the potential for increased disproportionality of impact on the populations that need the help the most. But I also leave some questions here. So first and foremost, the opportunity to understand risk using data, or even using anything, is a privilege. And I think we need to keep that in mind, no matter what. We are in a very privileged position in understanding risk, and thus in building early warning systems. In claiming success and effectiveness, to what extent are we focusing on this disproportionality? Disasters, anywhere we go, disasters lead to disproportionality of impact. In fragile settings, it is non-linear, let's say, in terms of the differences in that disproportionality. What happens when the official data and the government level data differs from what's best, sufficient, or most appropriate? Maybe I didn't word that question so well. But basically the point is this. In many situations, the Met Service or the Hydro Service may be issuing forecasts, but perhaps decision makers like in the refugee camps might say, well, we really want to use the local products, but everybody thinks that the global products are better. So what do you do with that case? What are the discussions that you have to have in order to build a system that acknowledges the presence of the official data, but also the reality of this is a rapidly changing situation that the local entities can't keep up with. Can the global entities that are providing data keep up with it? That's another question. But still, this happens a lot, particularly in the most fragile contexts. And then mandates do not equal trust and do not equal use. Just because something is mandated does not mean people trust it and use it. And this is definitely something coming out emerging this week, which I'm very glad to see. So thank you all for your time. I'm glad to discuss some of these elements later on. Thanks for the opportunity to share some of this.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. I think it's really fascinating to hear, that first-hand experience and like the details that you had to live with interactions. And so you talk a lot about the decision-making process of the institutional level, but something that I have been very intrigued and interested is in the decision-making process from the family or the individual perspective. And I remember my husband had to go to Bangladesh because he's a global shelter manager in India. And we talk a lot about this. And one of the things that he found very sad and deeply tragic when thinking about a family taking a decision to leave based on a full class is that because there was so much trauma because of the conflict that they had experienced back in Myanmar, a lot of the families were thinking of I'm settled here, I'm not gonna move. Even you give me a flood forecast, I'm just not moving, I'm okay, leave me alone, because there is this mental health baggage and a lot of ideas of what would happen if I actually leave because of this early warning system, when I leave my house. So I think, how did you experience that in these discussions with the interagency committee? Did it came into the equation?
So, what's the best way to to react? So, it wasn't a primary element of the discussions, and I think there were different reasons why. One of the reasons is because just the classification of the Rohingya people that were living in Bangladesh. The camps were actually split between UNHCR management and IOM management, which led to additional complexities of the rights of the population, the opportunities to leave the camp, the mobility elements and immobility elements related to it. So it was assumed, I would say, that there is limited mobility within the sub-camps. And it was part of the discussion, but it wasn't a primary element. The let's say spatial unit that was used was the sub-camps. I forget exactly what the number was. So in Kutupalong there was, I think, 29 sub-camps, but then you had other smaller camps throughout southeastern Bangladesh, about, 20 to 60 kilometers, across a region 20 to 60 kilometers. So yeah, they were definitely different areas, but also different parts of the camps were exposed to different types of hazards. So that was one of the challenges and one of the points that we brought up. It's in some parts of the camp, storm surge from tropical cyclones was a primary risk. In other parts of the camp, there was zero risk, or very close to zero risk of storm surge. How do the different populations within the refugee camp perceive the different types of flood risk? And that was part of some of the discussions we had with the Magi leaders, who are the religious leaders within the camps. So I think that's one of the ways to answer the question. The religious leaders of the camps were part of the discussion of early warning, but mostly on the dissemination side. I do think there could have been more integration in not only the local leaders, but also the religious leaders within the design of the standard operating procedures, perhaps. But it wasn't necessarily the case. It's actually a suggestion that I would have moving forward. But yeah, how is that built in within the governance? A lot of this does come into, if you're including new people, then things do change.
Yeah, totally. Good. So now, we have the opportunity to open the floor for any comments, maybe an addition, questions, anything that you want to contribute. It would be really great to hear, from people that has experienced this in the past, or anyone who has a question and is curious. So open the floor. I think Yelena, you have the. Oh, there you have it. Great. Perfect. Oh, you're there. Perfect. Okay, and then. I think we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I worked on DRR and a whole systems approach in fragile context. And what I found really important and striking in my own work, but also from the nation representative there, is the focus on resilience. And sadly, I'm not hearing that a lot in this conference on sessions on conflict in terms of when I speak of resilience and talking about a whole ecosystem approach to resilience. And you mentioned that when we think about kind of warnings for how to both prepare for and respond to different disasters, are we thinking of kind of the long-term effects on marginalized and underserved populations? And I think your simulation here also speaks to that, which the nation representative also did in terms of kind of the, it's not just the floods, it's the contaminants in the water that affects the livelihood that are going to go well beyond, years and years. Sorry. My apologies. So I just wanted to ask all of you and the panelists how we can incorporate kind of this resilience perspective a little bit more, especially for communities that are underserved or marginalized and whose main concerns are their livelihoods and their kind of long-term well-being. Thank you.
Great, I am so happy to ask this question because we tend to kind of like go on the bubble of the early warning system discussion, but it is essential to be very clear that early warning systems is just one of the pieces of the puzzle, and it's just part of that bigger disaster risk reduction effort that has to be put in the first place. So when we talk about how do we make sure to reduce risk, to adapt, to get to that point of resilience, we definitely need to think about the big picture and all the elements that needs to happen, and then being the early warning, that extra element that help us to manage those residual risks. So I think it's a very important thing. And the way how I look at it within the early warning system setup is that a lot of the investments that you do in setting up an early warning system or anticipatory action system also have a lot of impact on long-term projects. Because if you do a risk analysis, you just don't do it for the early warning system. It's part of the big picture and vice versa. So I think it's extremely essential to look at this as part of a system and not just as the early warning is going to save the day and it's going to save the world, because it's not going to happen. So I love that point. Thank you.
I think you've hit the nail on the head in terms of, I was at the Africa Climate Summit last week, and I asked everybody I met and went to the most amazing sessions of impacts of climate change on communities and the far-reaching impacts, all the way through to cattle and livelihood and girls being sold and all this kind of stuff. Just awful, far-reaching effects. And the one thing that we've been working with as well is climate change impacts the 2050s and 2080s in the country, and trying to understand what we know is going to happen pretty much by the 2050s, and then potentially what could be mitigated. But even if you know this is going to happen, if you're in the southern part of the country and your whole life is tied into cattle, trading, livelihood, culture, festivities, whatever it is, and you've been there for generations, how do you then think, oh my goodness, in 20 years I'm going to be sowing something else, I'm going to be, some other crop, or I'm going to have to move internally. And I don't understand how we start to have those conversations now to start getting people adapting. And I don't think any government wants to address that, because it's so sensitive and it's so tied up in social science and behaviors. I mean, again, you know, there's a lot of people starting to head into that world to understand how we can actually have an impact, but I'm not sure anyone's really figured out the answer to that question yet.
Thank you. Thanks for your question and reactions. One of the challenges in the refugee camp related to resilience is related to the standards of refugee camp siting and construction of shelter in the refugee camp and engineering within the refugee camp. There are limitations on the degree to which these should be formalized in order to align with the specific laws that the refugees have. And in many ways, this creates a very real tension, with building sufficient housing and sufficient structures and other elements that can significantly increase risk of impact from extreme events, for sure. This is one of the reasons why UNDP was part of the work. UNDP acknowledged that, everyone acknowledged that this will likely be a protracted crisis, and one of the reasons why is that the Rohingya refugee crisis is not new. It's been going on since the 80s at a smaller scale. So this is a unique situation even compared to refugee camps because of that. And there were considerations, but still there are limitations to what type of housing can be built. I mean, even if funding was available for better construction, enhanced construction, more flood resilient construction, it is unclear if those buildings would be allowed to be built. But I think we need to make sure we ask those questions, and to the extent that these standards can be informed or improved, I'm an advocate for that. Now, we also need to keep in mind the limitations of the data, the quality of the data in many of these places. We have a paper that just came out recently related to climate exposure to extreme events and other climate variables in refugee camps in East Africa. But we're trying to get to a similar question. But it does go back to the standard operating procedures in camp siting, and then also the various other, let's say, socioeconomic elements of maintaining and managing the camp.
I am conscious of the time, and I know we want to go for drinks. So I know we're desperate to go for drinks. So I would thank you. That was like really, it's just lovely to have you always in the panel. So applause. So I'm gonna invite John to go back here and give us some last reflections. What is the way forward from the Cruz perspective, but beyond that?
Thank you, Catalina, and thank you all for your patience and staying here until the end and participating in this excellent session. I am certainly agreeing with me. There's obviously a lot more to be said on this area of work. This was an excellent session in itself, and obviously we had some of the best thinkers on the topic between Catalina and Andrew. Thank you very much for contributing to this discussion. We're also looking very much forward to working with UK Met and the WISER program. There's many areas where the WISER program has been pushing on our understanding and knowledge in this area, and this is probably working in conflict and fragile situations. So we look forward again, as usual, to closely collaborating. And looking ahead, I think we're going to continue working on this topic. It's going to remain topical for a while. I have to say, unfortunately, it's a sad state of affairs. But that's the way the situation in which we function is. So we'd like to continue iteratively learning and understanding how we can be more effective, learning to work with new types of institutions like you have, Andrew, with the humanitarian actors in a refugee context. We just have to continue learning on how to do this better. And I'd like to mention also as part of the Center of Excellence that UNDRR and WMO have set up, they are developing some guidance on how to develop early warning systems in fragile and conflict situations. So that will be, hopefully, the discussions today will feed into that process and help us move forward. And we'll certainly continue supporting this work. So before we pass the floor to our excellent summary, the visual summaries of the discussion, I look forward to how you actually captured this discussion. If I can just ask you to to thank the speakers one more time, and also my colleague Jelena, who also was actually the brain and who helped set up this session. So thank you very much.
Yes, so yeah, no, thanks to you actually for the leadership on this topic. So before we go there, one last message, like if you are interested, continue the discussion on this topic, we have a working group in the Anticipation Hub, which is just focused on this topic. So you're like really all very welcome to join. As John said, we're also writing these guidelines. So there's a lot that we will be doing. And actually, we will be doing a training on conflict sensitivity for anticipatory action or early warning systems very soon. So in the Anticipation Hub website, you will be able to find the information, but it would be great if you want to join that. So now over to you. Thank you so much.
Right, is it? Yeah, it's the right way around. Okay, so I would just, since it's time to get drinks and celebrate the second day, I would just like to zoom into a few things. So what you did first is to ask yourselves what you do first in this fictional country of, I think it's Turmerington, something like that. So to set up an early warning system, so that was the first exercise here. Then you talked a bit about your PhD and the research that's out there at the moment. And then with all the different programs, I just want to put out some of the ideas to use what's working already. So he's inventing the wheel again to then use this, what's out there already, and to build something together. And then I'm just gonna move to this, and in Bangladesh, so the guy talking about saving lives, but the question is whether he's actually doing that. And I've also put down the two questions I have mentioned: which one is the best forecasting tool? Which one do we trust? And then, as the last image to show for today, is who benefits from this? Are the right people actually reached in these strategies and things that are being done?